I had lived on this street for nearly 2 years, and though I noticed the people who came and went, I rarely thought much about them. The neighbors across from me had children, 2 little ones with endless energy. Their laughter often spilled into the evenings, echoing against the houses until the sun dipped low. It wasn't the children I noticed, though. It was the woman who cared for them, the nanny. She wasn't much older than my mother's friends, maybe in her early 40s. She carried herself with a kind of grace that made her presence impossible to ignore. She dressed simply, light summer dresses, sometimes a cardigan thrown over her shoulders, but somehow even those small choices seemed deliberate, elegant. Her hair was always tied loosely, as though she had rushed through the day but never lost control of herself. I watched her from my porch more times than I'd admit. Not in any inappropriate way, just curious. She had an air about her, something composed yet quietly vulnerable. She smiled easily at the children, her laughter carrying gently when they clung to her arms or begged for one more story. But the first time I realized her smile could be different was late one afternoon. The children had gone inside, leaving her alone in the yard to tidy scattered toys. I was sitting with a book, though my eyes weren't really on the page. When she looked up, her gaze fell across the street and met mine. She smiled, polite at first, the way neighbors do. But as the silence stretched, something changed. It was softer, slower. Her lips curved gently, but her eyes lingered on me in a way that unsettled my chest. It wasn't the smile she gave the children, nor the one she gave the other parents who came to pick them up. It was quieter, meant for no one else. I froze, unsure of how to respond. I could feel my heartbeat thudding a little faster, almost embarrassed by how much a simple look affected me. I raised a hand in a small wave, half expecting her to look away. Instead, she tilted her head just slightly, as though amused by my awkwardness, and her smile deepened before she returned to her task. That night, lying in bed, I thought about it again. I replayed the curve of her lips, the steadiness of her gaze, the way the fading sunlight caught in her hair. Why had it felt so different? Why did it seem like a secret, something she hadn't intended anyone else to notice? I told myself I was imagining it, that it was nothing more than neighborly kindness. But deep down, I knew better. There are smiles you forget the moment you turn away, and then there are smiles that press themselves quietly into your memory. Hers was the latter. And though I didn't know it then, that small, lingering smile across the street was the beginning of everything. It was a Saturday afternoon when our first real conversation happened. The sun was bright, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer above the pavement. I had gone out to check the mail, half distracted, when I noticed her struggling with a grocery bag at the back of her car. The trunk was full, brown paper bags lined up neatly, though one had already given way at the bottom. A carton of milk rested dangerously against the edge, and a bunch of fresh parsley had slipped halfway out. She bent to catch it, strands of her hair falling forward, and for the first time, she looked less like the composed, graceful woman I was used to seeing and more like someone human, flustered, juggling too much at once. Before I even thought about it, I crossed the street. "Here, let me help," I said, reaching for the collapsing bag. She straightened up quickly, startled, though her expression softened as she recognized me. "Oh, thank you. These bags never seem strong enough, do they?" Her voice had that warm, low timbre I'd only half heard from across the street before. Up close, it carried more weight, more calm. As I steadied the bag in my arms, our hands brushed. Just the briefest touch, her fingers grazing mine as she let go, but it left a warmth that lingered longer than it should have. She didn't pull back sharply, only glanced at me with that faint, knowing smile, the one that already had a place in my memory. We carried the groceries up the small path to the neighbor's porch. She unlocked the door, holding it open for me as I stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of lemons and laundry soap, the lived-in scent of children and order. "You're very kind," she said, setting another bag on the counter. "Most people just pretend not to notice when someone's struggling." I shrugged, trying not to look as self-conscious as I felt. "Well, I was pretending to read my mail. That counts as noticing, right?" She laughed, quietly but real. And for some reason, I felt proud of myself for drawing that sound out of her. We spoke only in small talk at first: the long summer, the children's endless energy, the neighborhood trees that shed more leaves than anyone could rake. But beneath it, I sensed something unspoken. The way her gaze lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary. The way her hand rested briefly against the counter as she leaned toward me, as though choosing not to stand too far away. When I finally stepped back toward the door, she followed. At the threshold, she paused, her hands resting lightly on the frame. "Thank you," she said again, softer this time. And then there it was, that smile. Not the cheerful one she wore for the world, but the slower, private one she reserved for moments when we were alone. I walked back across the street with my heart unreasonably unsteady. The image of her standing in the doorway burned into me like sunlight that lingers even after your eyes close. The storm arrived without warning. One moment the sky was a pale, cloudless blue, and the next it had darkened, heavy with rolling gray. I was inside, half listening to music, when the first crack of thunder rattled the windows. Rain came almost instantly after, sheets of it, slamming against the street, flooding the gutters within minutes. I stood at the window, watching the neighborhood blur in silver lines, when a knock sounded at my door. It startled me. No one ever came by unannounced. When I opened it, she stood there, damp hair clinging to her temples, a cardigan pulled tightly across her shoulders, rain droplets still sliding down her arms. She gave me a sheepish smile, one I'd never seen from her before, as though caught between embarrassment and relief. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, her voice just loud enough to rise above the storm. "The power went out across the street. The kids are with their parents tonight, and well, I didn't want to sit in the dark by myself." I stepped aside before I even thought about it. "Of course. Come in." She crossed the threshold, shaking rain from her sleeves. The faint scent of lavender clung to her, mingling with the damp air. I fetched a towel, and she accepted it with quiet thanks, pressing it against her hair as she glanced around my living room. "It feels strange, being on this side of the street," she said with a soft laugh, almost to herself. I smiled, trying to ease her unease. "It's not much different. Just a worse view." That earned me a glance, playful, but brief. She settled onto the couch as though testing whether she was allowed, her hands folded carefully in her lap. I put water on for tea. When I returned, she was looking out the window, where the rain had softened into a steady rhythm. "Storms always make me feel like a child again," she said. "As if the world outside is too wild to step into, so you're forced to sit still and just listen." There was something about the way she said it, reflective, almost wistful, that pulled me closer. I handed her the mug, watching the steam rise between us. We talked then, not about the neighborhood or the weather, but about her. She spoke of how the children adored her, but how, at the end of each day, she often returned to silence. How people assumed she was endlessly strong, endlessly patient, yet there were nights when she felt the weight of it all pressing in. I listened more than I spoke. There was a fragility in her honesty, a glimpse behind the composed woman I had only observed from across the street. She wasn't fragile in the sense of weakness. No, she was too steady for that. But she was human, and in that humanness, I found myself drawn closer. When the storm finally eased, she rose reluctantly, as though she wasn't quite ready to leave. She thanked me again, her fingers brushing lightly against mine as she set down the mug. That touch, small as it was, carried more warmth than the tea had. And just before she stepped back out into the damp evening air, she gave me that same smile, quiet, lingering, meant only for me. After that evening of the storm, something between us shifted. It wasn't spoken aloud, and it wasn't obvious to anyone else, but I felt it every time I saw her. The polite smiles across the street had become warmer, steadier. And whenever our paths crossed, there lingered a pause, as though either of us quite wanted the moment to end. One Sunday afternoon, I found myself invited into her world again. She was in the front yard with the children, trying to repair the handle of a toy wagon. I had been on my porch, pretending to be busy with my phone, when she looked up and called across the street. "Do you know anything about tools?" she asked, her tone half teasing, half serious. I laughed. "Enough to pretend I do." That was enough. Moments later, I was kneeling beside her in the grass, screwdriver in hand, while she steadied the little wagon. The children darted around us, chasing each other, their laughter filling the warm air. She leaned close to see what I was doing, her hair brushing against my shoulder as she bent. I caught the faint scent of her shampoo, something clean and light, like citrus and sun. For a moment my hands stilled, the proximity of her presence distracting me more than I cared to admit. "There," I said, tightening the last screw. "It should hold now." She smiled, grateful. "You've saved the day." Again. The children raced off with the wagon, leaving us suddenly without their noise as a buffer. We sat in the grass, watching them, and the conversation drifted into laughter over small things, the stubbornness of children, the quirks of neighbors, even my poor attempt at repairing things. At one point, she laughed so fully that her hand slipped onto my forearm, almost without her realizing it. It was such a natural gesture, but it froze me. Her touch was light, but the warmth of her palm spread slowly through me, sinking deeper than I expected. When her laughter faded, she seemed to notice what she'd done. Her hand lingered just a second too long before pulling back, and in that pause, our eyes met. It wasn't a stare, not at first. It was simply a glance, but one that held steady, as though either of us wanted to look away. The children's voices rang in the distance, but in that instant, the world felt quiet. I swallowed, unsure of what I was supposed to say. My mind screamed for me to break the silence, but my chest wanted it to last. She shifted slightly, her expression unreadable, yet her lips curved into that familiar smile. The one I had come to know belonged only to me. The moment passed, as moments always do. She rose, brushing grass from her dress, calling after the children. I stood too, but my thoughts stayed locked on the lingering warmth of her hand. It wasn't just the smile anymore. It was the touch. The closeness. The way something unspoken kept threading itself tighter between us, quiet but undeniable. And I knew then, we were stepping into dangerous territory. It was late in the evening when it happened. The kind of evening where the air carries a hush, as if the world has slowed down to rest. I was sitting on my porch, half lost in thought, listening to the cicadas hum and the soft rustle of leaves. The houses were quiet, windows glowing faintly with the lives unfolding inside them. Then I noticed her. She crossed the street with no rush, her figure framed in the amber glow of a street lamp. She carried nothing with her, no bags, no books, just herself. Her steps were steady, purposeful, yet there was a softness in her posture, as if she had been carrying the weight of the day and wanted to set it down. "Do you mind if I sit?" she asked, her voice gentle, almost hesitant. "Not at all," I said, shifting to make room. She lowered herself onto the step beside me. For a few moments we didn't speak. The night was filled with small sounds, the hum of insects, a dog barking faintly in the distance, the low buzz of an old street light. Her shoulder brushed mine lightly as she settled in, and though it could have been nothing more than chance, she didn't move away. "It's strange," she said after a long silence. "Sometimes I feel like I spend my whole life being seen, but never really noticed." Her words caught me off guard. I turned to her, but she wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were on the dark horizon, her expression calm but thoughtful. "People see me with the children," she continued. "They see me as reliable, patient, dependable. And that's good, I want to be all those things. But sometimes," she trailed off, her voice lowering, "sometimes I wonder if anyone sees me for more than that. For who I actually am." I didn't know what to say at first. My throat tightened with the weight of her honesty, with the trust it carried. Finally I managed, "I see you." She turned then, her gaze meeting mine. In the dim light, her eyes looked softer, deeper. "Do you?" she asked, not as a challenge, but as if the answer truly mattered. "Yes," I said quietly. "You're different. You make this place feel different. When you're around, it doesn't feel like just another street, just another day. You matter. At least to me. For a moment, the silence thickened between us. Her lips parted slightly, her breath catching as though she hadn't expected me to be so direct. Then she smiled, not the polite one, not even the private one I'd grown used to. This smile carried relief, a kind of fragile gratitude. Her shoulder pressed against mine, closer this time, deliberate. That means more than you know, she whispered. We sat like that, side by side, our hands resting just inches apart on the wooden step. Neither of us reached across the space, but the tension in that gap was almost electric. I could feel it, the quiet confession that had passed between us, unspoken and spoken all at once. And in that stillness, I realized, something had shifted again. We weren't just neighbors sharing moments anymore. We were two people standing at the edge of something neither of us could ignore. The night was cooler than usual, the kind that carries the faint smell of damp earth after a long day. We had lingered on my porch longer than either of us planned, our conversation stretching past small talk and into the kind of honesty that feels rare. When she finally stood, brushing her hand against her skirt, I offered to walk her home. The street was quiet as we crossed it together. The children's house stood ahead, its windows dark. A single porch light glowed faintly, illuminating the garden gate. We walked slowly, as if both of us were reluctant for the moment to end. At the gate, she paused. Her hand rested lightly on the latch, but she didn't open it. Instead, she turned toward me. Her eyes searched mine, and for a heartbeat I forgot about the night, the street, the rest of the world. Thank you, she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. For listening. For noticing me. The words carried a weight that made my chest tighten. I nodded, but before I could speak, she reached up. At first, I thought she was adjusting her hair, tucking a strand behind her ear. But her hand shifted, her fingertips grazing my cheek. The touch was feather-light, almost accidental, yet it sent a current through me, sharp and steady. I leaned in slightly, without meaning to, or maybe meaning to more than I'd admit. The air between us changed. Her breath brushed against my skin, warm, uncertain. My heart pounded with the dangerous knowledge of how close we suddenly were. Her hand lingered against my face, trembling just enough for me to notice. Her eyes flicked to my lips and back again, and in that second, the world seemed to hold its breath. I could have closed the distance. I wanted to. Every part of me ached to bridge that tiny gap, to turn what we both felt into something undeniable. But then she drew in a sharp breath and stepped back, lowering her hand. The movement was gentle, but final. It's too much, she whispered, her voice breaking just slightly. Too soon. The ache of her words struck harder than I expected, yet I understood. She was careful, protective, not only of herself, but of me too. I swallowed, forcing steadiness into my voice. I know, I said quietly. I understand. We stood there, the silence between us thick with what almost happened. She looked at me once more, her eyes soft, conflicted, before turning toward the house. The gate clicked shut behind her, and I watched as she disappeared into the dim light. Walking back across the street alone, I carried the ghost of her touch on my cheek, the warmth of her breath still hovering in memory. It wasn't a kiss, not yet. But it was enough to make me certain that whatever was growing between us was real, even if either of us was ready to name it aloud. The days that followed carried a quiet shift. I didn't see her as often, not in the way I had grown used to. She still came and went with her usual rhythm, tending to the children, walking across the yard with that graceful calm of hers. But now, every time I caught sight of her, I was reminded of the night at the gate, the near kiss, the touch on my cheek, and the soft words that had stopped us both in our tracks. I tried to convince myself not to read into it. Perhaps it had been nothing more than a passing moment, something best left unspoken. Yet I couldn't shake the memory. It lingered in me like the echo of a song that refuses to fade. One afternoon, I stepped outside with a cup of coffee. The neighborhood was alive with its usual sounds, a lawnmower humming faintly in the distance, the shrieks of children playing somewhere down the street. Across the road, the children she cared for were tumbling around in their yard, laughter rising and falling like waves. And then, there she was, standing near the garden, her hands loosely folded as she watched over them. The sunlight caught in her hair, softening the edges, and for a moment she looked less like the composed woman everyone else saw and more like the one who had leaned against my shoulder, who had admitted to feeling invisible. Her eyes lifted, as though she felt me watching. They met mine across the street, steady and unhurried. For an instant, I braced myself for the polite smile, the kind that neighbors exchange out of habit. But it wasn't that smile. It was different. This one carried no hesitation, no mask of professionalism, no quick glance away. It was slow, deliberate, filled with a quiet warmth that seemed to reach me even from across the distance. There was trust in it, and something deeper, an unspoken acknowledgement of what we had shared, of what had almost happened, of what still waited between us. My chest tightened, not with the sharp ache of longing, but with something gentler, reassurance. That smile told me she hadn't pulled away because she didn't feel what I felt. She had pulled away because it mattered to her too much to rush. I lifted my hand in a small, almost shy wave. She tilted her head slightly, her lips curving just a little more, and in that moment, I understood. Love, or whatever name we were circling around, didn't need to be hurried. It didn't need to be spoken too soon. Sometimes it begins not with grand gestures or declarations, but with the smallest things, a lingering touch, a late-night conversation, a smile across the street that changes everything. I lowered my hand, still smiling to myself, and took a slow breath. Whatever this was, it was real. And for now, that was enough.